hypothetical experiment where we have two individuals, call them Harry and John. They own two firms, and that these two firms compete with each other. And then the first step in the thought experiment is to ask them, well, suppose that Harry is really the hardworking guy. He saves and invests a lot and is able to improve his production techniques. He becomes much more productive and ends up out-competing John. As a result of which, John basically loses his firm. He has to shut down his factory. His employees lose their job. And the question is, how do you feel about that? And pretty much everybody says, well, this is how markets are supposed to work. And this is if somebody works harder, saves more, invests more, comes up with better ideas, then this is, of course, how it ought to work. And it's too bad that some people are losing their jobs, but in the long run, this is how we progress. Then I say, okay, suppose what has actually happened is that the reason that the way in which Harry has outcompeted John is actually that Harry has managed to do some outsourcing. That he's found a cheaper supplier. Let's say that this cheaper supplier is actually in Germany, and that is managing to bring some. It could have been Poland. Managing to bring some cheaper inputs. Of course, cheaper inputs is just like better technology, and therefore he becomes more competitive, is able to outcompete John. How do you feel about that? Now, at this point, I will have lost a few people because some are actually uncomfortable about the notion of outsourcing being leading to dislocation and some people losing out and people losing their jobs or suffering earnings reductions. Although I emphasize to them, of course, that from an economic standpoint, the implications of this is exactly identical to the first. In fact, to the extent that there was some disutility to effort and saving and investment, in fact, the second one enlarges the size of the pie to a much greater extent than the first, but of course creates the same kind of distributional issues. But at this point, most people are saying that this is okay. Then I say, okay, suppose it was actually a different kind of outsourcing. Outsourcing didn't involve Germany. It involved Harry finding an Indonesian affiliate who was able to produce much cheaper inputs by employing child workers in 12-hour day shifts and are extremely hazardous conditions. Okay? Again, from an economic standpoint, this is exactly identical to the previous case. One can think of this as exactly the same kind of comparative advantage-based trade as one that's based on Ricardian differences in technology or differences in factor endowments. In fact, many of my colleagues, trade economists, would think that these two cases are virtually indistinguishable. One doesn't care how comparative advantage is created. But most people in my audience and most students at this point sort of think that there is something fundamentally wrong about this, that even though this too is outsourcing, this too provides the same kinds of economic gains, that in some sense the gains that are generated on behalf of Harry and the losses that John incurs are in some sense illegitimate. Something has happened here in the manner in which the size of the pie has increased, in the manner in which these redistributions have been created is not entirely legitimate, that it might be acceptable in this case to perhaps put some barriers on this kind of trade. Then the last example is to sort of to shake up whether they're my colleagues, trade economists who believe in free trade and therefore think that this is okay. After all, by the way, nothing in the world, nothing in trade rules, nothing in the WTO actually prohibits the last kind of exchange. In fact, by World Trade Organization rules, if we were to impose a barrier on this kind of a trade, Indonesia could then take us to court. Indonesia could actually win a case in the WTO for restricting that kind of a trade. And many trade lawyers and certainly most trade economists I know would say that in fact this is okay. It's up to Indonesia to determine what its child labor practices and labor relations are. To them, for them, I have the last version of the thought experiment, which is to say, suppose what has really happened is not outsourcing, but actually that Harry has brought in child workers from Indonesia into the country. So this is the U.S. This is they brought in child workers into the United States, put them to work under temporary contract and under conditions that violate U.S. labor and environmental laws. Now, at this point, even the trade economists, even the free traders are going to say, no, no, you can't do that. And it's not always a very well-considered response as to why this is not okay. But in some sense, they're uncomfortable about this. They might say, well, this is illegal. Of course, it's illegal. But the question is, from an economic standpoint, what is different precisely about case 4 from case 3? And what moral or ethical principle distinguishes? Why is it that case 3 would be okay while case 4 would not? And I think it has been the reluctance of liberal economists to engage in precisely these kinds of normative discussions having to do with issues of distributional justice, questions of procedural fairness, that essentially has made them a relatively tone deaf to many of the issues around globalization and the issues of fairness that arises around considerations of globalization. Now I want to expand on this. The main point that this series of thought experiments, I think, highlight is that trade is similar to regular economic exchange, regular market exchange that takes place within a domestic context, and is also dissimilar. It is similar insofar it creates losers and gainers at the same time that it expands the size of the pie. It creates wider economic opportunities. In this sense, trade is precisely the same as regular exchange in the domestic setting. So that creates a sort of intuitions about why one should not interfere in trade. But at the same time, there's something different about trade compared to domestic exchange, which is that it creates competition under ground rules that we have prohibited at home. And that's the big difference with globalization, that we are talking about exchanges that cross jurisdictional boundaries, therefore exchanges that cross rules. And therefore, they are going to involve, just as in my example of whether you're employing child workers in Indonesia or you're employing them at home, it's immaterial. That the fact that you're employing them abroad, if employing them at home isn't right, employing them abroad isn't necessarily right either, in the sense that both of them have the consequence of undermining rules that we've established for exchange at home. So the basic argument here is that when we are talking about competition or market exchange that takes place, that crosses jurisdictional boundaries, where the rules and institutional regulations are very different. We have situations where such competition can undermine domestic norms, as in my example, in terms of what's an acceptable redistribution. They will undermine regulations, so what's an acceptable tax rates, what's the right level of financial regulation, what's our product safety rules, as well as a wide range of institutional practices, many of which might be informal, such as the employment relationship, labor market practices that might be undermined by virtue of competition that involves crossing jurisdictional boundaries. Now, I think there are different ways in which we can respond to these kinds of issues that globalization creates, and I'm going to be highlighting a number of different circumstances. One response, and the one that's actually pretty much common among my colleagues in the US, is to ignore the problem and simply keep pushing for deeper globalization. And when we do that, then we are going to be running into an exacerbation of these kinds of problems of conflict about norms, conflicts about regulations, conflicts about institutional practices. A second approach is to say, well, let's try to diminish these differences in jurisdictional boundaries and therefore try to harmonize the rules. Let's make the rules join. The cost of this, of course, is that then you're going to start imposing rules and regulations that may not be particularly consistent with the needs and preferences of different localities, different countries, or may not be particularly well adapted to what they need. And so we talk about both about differences across advanced societies as well as the needs of advanced versus developing countries. Of course, logically, the third option is to say that, well, you know, if we cannot do the first and the second, then logically the other option is to consider how we can restrict the depth of globalization or the scope of globalization such that these problems become less binding. And you have to, of course, imagine that the kind of child labor problem that I illustrated this with is really a very, very tiny fraction of global trade. And the problem is that, however, if we do not make distinctions between that kind of trade, which does raise serious normative issues, and the 95% of trade which doesn't, then in terms of the conflicts over trade, in terms of the legitimacy of the rules, we're going to create opposition to much larger scope of trade than just that 5% that is truly controversial. So I've always preferred sort of making those distinctions so that we can precisely save the 95% of trade that is not problematic from the 5% that it would, as opposed to many of my colleagues who sort of, you know, apply some kind of, you know, vague, slippery slope kind of an argument that says once you start this, you're never going to stop, and therefore you'll get all protectionism all over. Now, the globalization trilemma is actually a more elaborate conceptualization of these choices. I'd like to sort of lay it out through a historical overview of the development of globalization. When we go to the first era of globalization, the gold standard, it was a system which achieved significant amounts of financial integration in particular, as well as trade integration, but particularly financial integration. Levels of financial integration that actually we have attained only recently in the last 2 decades or so. And it was also, of course, a system where you know, political authority was divided between various countries. So it was a system that combined an advanced form of globalization with a system where sovereignty rulemaking was still embedded under different nation states or under different countries. And the manner in which essentially this was made to work was because of an understanding of economic policy that basically said the be-all and end-all of economic policy, to the extent that we talked about economic policy in the 1880s, 1890s, in the pre-World War I period, was to actually maintain the gold standard. There was no other rule. So forget about any kind of other economic policy objectives that might conflict with the gold standard. So what essentially that meant was that the gold standard was sustainable only to the extent that you could insulate economic policy making from the demands of the broader polity, which wasn't a problem because there was no broader polity. After all, the franchise didn't, you know, extend until the 20th century in most countries. The vote was very limited. Most countries weren't really democracies. And in fact, we've seen how democracy became incompatible with the gold standard, precisely with the ill-fated attempt of Britain to return to the gold standard in 1925. And ultimately, when British government was faced between maintaining high interest rates so as to be able to keep on gold versus the demands of working people and the demands of broader industrialists and the political demand to get off gold so that interest rates could be reduced. At that point in 1931, Britain chose to do what the people wanted as opposed to what the bankers wanted. And we've seen a replay of this, I think, in a number of different settings. Tom Friedman, in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, has this sort of nice phrase that, that describes what happens to politics under gold standard type rules. Is that you basically, politics becomes a choice between Coke and Pepsi. And all other, all other sort of flavors are impossible, because the moment you try to do something a little bit different, then just capital flows out en masse. Now, I don't think that really describes our world, because I don't think we are hyper-globalized in the sense of a world economy without any transactions costs associated with borders. But it does describe, I think, a world in which we would be hyper-globalized, and one that really maximizes the efficiency of resource allocation in an economic sense of the world. Now, there was a very big lesson that Keynes drew from the failure of the gold standard. And this is exactly consistent with the trilemma, and the lesson that Keynes drew was that in this modern era, with mass politics, with organized labor markets, mass franchise, media, and institutionalized labor markets and trade unions, that really you could not maintain a very open economy. In particular, that you couldn't maintain openness to capital flows. And therefore, what political scientists have called the embedded liberalism compromise, or the Bretton Woods compromise of the early post-World War II decades, essentially were an adaptation of Keynes's own preference for creating sufficient policy space for national democracies to be able to manage their economies. And of course, what Keynes meant was basically counter-cyclical policy. But that became a much broader range of policies, in the sense that national economic management in the years after the Second World War became not just business cycle policy. It was also creating a social welfare state, erecting social safety nets, and for a growing number of countries that we later came to call developing nations, it was following industrial policies and import substitution policies so that they could restructure their economies. And the Bretton Woods Compromise essentially was one that said, we are going to throw enough sense in the wheel of finance and trade, because after all, the GATT regime was very lacked ambition compared to the WTO in terms of how much liberalization was really undertaken. We're going to put a lot of sand in the wheels of the global economy so as to ensure that, that countries have enough space to develop their own economic and social models and manage their economies in ways that would be consistent with preferences of their citizenry, and that governments and economic authorities would have the room to respond to their democratic or otherwise electorates. So therefore, for example, in this era, capital controls played a very critical role, and famously Keynes said with regard to capital controls that this was not a temporary expedient. He viewed capital controls as a permanent element in this post-war international economic regime, because he thought that was important to allow domestic governments to manage their economies, and in turn that was important to allow a relatively healthy, sustainable system of world trade. So you would actually get a prosperous world economy with vastly growing volumes of international trade and direct investment if domestic economies were actually politically and economically healthy. Then under the kind of attack from too much openness, and in that way, I think I think his system worked quite well until it began to ravel in the 1970s and the 1980s. Now, I think sort of many of the problems of the post-Bretton Woods era arise from the fact that sort of we find ourselves with this desire to, pushed the frontiers of globalization towards hyper-globalization, sort of not just reducing barriers on trade and eliminating capital controls, but also undertaking the domestic economic policies that would remove any semblance of barriers to trade. So that would mean essentially ensuring that your regulations and your rules are consistent with those of your trade partners. Of course, it has gone all the way to monetary unification in the case of the Eurozone, so that you can eliminate exchange risk as a transaction cost in international trade and international finance, and so forth. And I think, as I tried to illustrate with my thought experiment at the very beginning of my talk, I think this new system, which sort of is characterized on the one hand by extreme form of financial globalization, in the other with GATT Plus, or the World Trade Organization, has created on the one hand failures of legitimacy, where global rules have often gone too far, and or failures of regulation, where in fact they didn't go far enough, as in the case of international finance. Now, logically, of course, there is another way that we can combine these various strings, and this would be to essentially say, well, look, if the problem with economic globalization, or the problem with trying to achieve hyper-globalization is that you need to eliminate the transactions costs associated with the border, but that means that domestic policies cannot be responsive to domestic constituents. Logically, what we can do is essentially just take politics to the level of the economic union, and therefore combine democracy with hyper-globalization with some kind of a regime of global governance. And of course, that means that now we are explicitly giving up on national sovereignty, self-determination in any significant way, because we're simply reconstructing in some way a global economy, global polity, in ways that where the constituent states become somewhat like the states in the U.S. federal republic, and of course this also has implications for the way that we would think about the Eurozone that I might come back to in a second. But that logically is the third alternative. So the trilemma, therefore, is that we have a choice. To put the choice very starkly, is to say that of these three things, hyper-globalization, national sovereignty, and democratic politics, we can have at most two. And we cannot have all three of those things at the same time. And depending on which two we pick, we're going to have a different kind of that we're sacrificing one of those things. Bretton Woods regime sacrificed hyper-globalization. The golden straitjacket regime, or the gold standard, and in fact the Eurozone as it works today for the southern countries like Spain and Greece is effectively sacrificing democratic politics. Alternatively, we can imagine some kind of global governance, or in the case of the Eurozone, a true European-wide political community and political Europe to go along with an economic union in Europe, in which case, of course, national politicians would have to understand that the arena for politics, contestation, responsibility, accountability is really at the union-wide level, not the national, not the national capitals. Let me just say a little bit more about how this trilemma works in different parts of the world economy, in different policy arenas. And I've already mentioned the Eurozone, but I will go over that rather quickly. Now, when we look at sort of different parts of the world economy, we have been implicitly applying we're making different choices with respect to how we solve or how we get out of the trilemma. And I'm not exactly sure that these are all considered choices. These are choices that we have fallen into either for historical reasons or because particular political interests or particular elites are good at applying or imposing their solutions, but not necessarily because these are normatively desirable. So let's think about three kinds of problems. One is when you're facing the importation of toys from a country, let's call that China, because this was a real case in the US, where it turns out that the toys coming from China contain levels of lead which are way above what's allowed in the domestic regime. So basically, the question is, what do you do when you're importing toys from a country where the actual practices, either in law or in the actual implementation, results in health and safety standards that are much lower, much more relaxed than yours? How do you respond to this? The second is sort of, how do you respond to questions about the spillovers of regulatory failures in one country to your own economy, so that now it's really the exporter of toxic goods or services, let's say it's the United States. So the US has had bad financial regulations and therefore has been exporting toxic assets, in other words, financial derivatives, whose risk characteristics are inappropriately described or rated. So these turn out to be sort of toxic assets. So the question is, how does the importing country react to this? And so note the parallel with the export of toxic toys and the export of toxic assets, two very different parts of the world economy, but they work in exactly the same way. And finally, going back to the child labor case, is actually not much different. That what happens when you are or thoroughly illegal in the domestic economy? How do you respond to that? Conceptually, these three problems are not all that different, in the sense that all of those have, all of these kinds of trade relationships or financial relationships have implications for the integrity of rules and regulations or normative systems in the domestic economy, in the sense that lead-tainted toys undermine public health, imports of toxic securities undermine financial stability, imports of goods made with child labor undermine long-standing social bargains reflected in labor laws. In all of these areas, in fact, you can apply the market principle, you can apply the neoliberal or sort of liberal reasoning, which says that in none of these cases do you really need regulation. All you need is for people to be sufficiently informed about the characteristics of these goods so that they can make informed choices. So that if you don't like goods that are made with child labor, don't buy them. If you think that these assets are toxic, don't buy them, and so on. And so this argument would be one where you say, well, these are all false dilemmas, because all you need really is to provide information to consumers globally. So the labeling, for example, movement would be partially a response to this, and say, and don't worry about sort of the consequence of globalization, or whether you should put on any restrictions. Governments should put any restriction on these kinds of things. But of course, one of the good things about the financial crisis is it has shown us how, in fact, the labeling argument doesn't work very well, because in practice, the manner in which these issues of securities would be solved was, there were institutions called credit rating agencies that were supposed to precisely label the toxicity or the risk characteristics of these different types of securities, and the government, in principle, didn't have to get involved at all. And we now know how bad that argument was. That in fact, by relying on this sort of so-called market-provided information about the underlying characteristics of financial assets, how badly we've gone. So next time you drink fair trade coffee, ask yourself the question of who exactly is assigning that label and how much information is there actually, and ask yourself, if that company, Starbucks for example, is selling you fair trade coffee, how come their other coffee isn't less expensive? So there's something going there that sort of that in principle these labeling aren't these sort of market-based approaches can only go so far. And in fact, we know that the manner in which we deal with these cases is we think that there's rule for public regulation. Now, going back to these three examples, I picked these three examples because the manner in which we've responded to them, is precisely those three solutions to the trilemma. Because how do we respond in practice to the importation of goods that may not satisfy domestic health and safety standards? In most countries, you simply ban them. You just don't allow them to come in. So that's the application of the Bretton Woods principle, or the Bretton Woods Compromise, which is to say every country is allowed to do things at the border to maintain the integrity of its own rules and regulation. If that means you have to ban goods that are made with, contain too much lead, you just ban them, and nobody really worries about this being an intervention in trade. Yet, when we talk about toxic assets, in much of the discussion about how we should deal with the consequences of the financial crisis and the problems of spillovers and contagion that financial globalization has created, pretty much 80% of the discussion really has been about global rules. How to harmonize global rules so that everybody can operate under the same set of rules. So the approach that we've been taking is essentially one of global governance rather than the Bretton Woods Compromise. The Bretton Woods Compromise, of course, would say, every country should decide what their own financial regulations are. So you pick your own point between financial innovation and financial stability. Some will prefer financial stability at the expense of innovation. Other countries might prefer the other. And then you are also free to restrict cross-border flows to the extent that such flows might undermine the point on that trade-off that you have selected. With respect to the imports of goods made with child labor, we have yet a third solution, which is the golden straitjacket solution, which is we have now made it actually illegal for a country to restrict such kind of trade, because we say trade is trade is trade. It doesn't matter, whether it's made with child labor, it harms the environment. It's produced under conditions that would be unconscionable in the home. So that's an example of where. So. It's not entirely clear. So here are three different solutions that we've applied in three different parts of the global economy. It's not entirely clear that we have done so in a considered way, in a way that reflects sort of a good, healthy domestic deliberation on these issues, as opposed to these solutions having been imposed either by sort of through historical legacy or because banks, for example, financial intermediates, financial institutions are particularly powerful, so they can get their method of imposition. So they'd much rather have a global set of rules rather than sort of imagine a situation where they're facing the transactions costs associated with regulatory diversity. The European Union, which of course in some sense could have been the exception in the sense of having moved towards joining political union with economic union, of course got caught in its process of integration, where a lot of the economic union had been undertaken, but the Eurozone was very far from the political union. So I'm not going to run through the sort of the various ways in which this has left the Eurozone quite fragile in a way that for example, the US as a true federal entity where each state has really given up its sovereignty, in return for which Washington, the federal center, takes responsibility for residents in each one of these states. And it's a truly national legal environment. So this has made a huge difference for the way that things would have worked out. A similar kind of crisis would have worked out in the US case. The trilemma, from the perspective of the Eurozone, essentially works out by saying, look, if you are not going to give up on democracy, if you take this sort of as a cornerstone, after all this, this is probably, the greatest achievement of human society, and in Western Europe is that we accept political democracy as a necessary part of the organization of our affairs. If you're not going to give up on democracy, then the choice that the Eurozone really faces is a very stark one. It says either political union, of course that's going to take a long time, but at least you have to start taking some steps. You can start to convince not just financial markets, but more importantly, your own domestic electorates that you are on a path where more and more they will be looking for answers in the Europe level rather than at the nation state level. Either that's going to be a reality, or if political union is not going to be on the cards, let's say because the French care too much about their own sovereignty, or the German leadership cannot convince their electorate that they really should form part of the same political community as those lazy Greeks. If that is not going to be a reality, the only alternative is really economic disunion. So either more political union or less economic union. Of course, that means in the Eurozone context a dissolution of the Eurozone. And I think, unfortunately, most of the choices that have been made up until this point are much more taking us in that direction rather than the political union direction. For the last 5 minutes or so, if I have just a few more minutes, I want to say just a little bit more about this tension between democracy and globalization, because I want to make this a rather more sophisticated argument than simply one that says anything that imposes restrictions on the ability of domestic policymakers to make policy is undemocratic. So I want to make sure that this is not my argument, that I'm making actually a more sophisticated argument. So I'll just take a few minutes to explain that. First, just to go back to the notion of hyperglobalization, just to be clear what I mean by that. I mean by that is sort of an ideal type. I mean an ideal type where, in fact, we have full economic union, full economic integration. That means the absence of transactions costs on international trade and finance. Now, what that means for policy at the level of nation states is that domestic governments can not impose, obviously, direct restrictions on goods, services, and assets at the border. So that's the most direct implication. But secondly, they must not have rules and regulation behind the border that has the cost of imposing restrictions or transactions costs at the border. So for example, if you have different financial regulations, different legal regimes, to the extent that it impedes cross-border flow of investment and finance, that's a transactions cost, and ideally an obstacle to be removed on the way to hyperglobalization. And third, the most demanding of all, of course, is that you do not want to create a lack of credibility. That these rules, well, now you've harmonized, now you're not imposing any restrictions, but in the future you might change your mind. And in fact, the mechanism through which the Eurozone ended up with currency union was precisely that sort of fixed exchange rates did not provide sufficient credibility that ultimately they would be maintained. So therefore, you take all discretion out of the system by moving to a single currency. Now, saying that economic integration restricts national policy is not a valid criticism per se, because democracies have do often choose to restrict their policy civics. There is the notion of democratic delegation that is democratic. In other words, delegation of policy-making authority to independent or autonomous agencies that does not violate the principles of democracy. And of course, at some level, checks and balances in constitutional democracies is an example of that. The delegation of monetary policy to independent central banks, of course, is another example. And there are many instances of democratic delegation that restricts what the executive can do or what it can do in response to the popular pressure or popular will, that is accepted because it actually enhances the performance of democracy in the medium to long term. And so in that sense is not really, is not necessarily in contradiction with democracy. there's a nice article by Bob Cohen and a couple of authors that enlarge on that point by developing an argument that they call democracy enhancing multilateralism. And one can, but ultimately they call it multilateralism, but I think in the back of their mind they have the idea of globalization, because they're trying to protect globalization, they're trying to defend globalization from those who say that globalization is inimical to democracy. And they say, look at all these ways in which globalization actually enhances democracy, and they have these three arguments that globalization can enhance democracy by offsetting factions. That is, that it reduces the power of groups that might have been particularly important. It might enhance democracy by protecting minority rights, such as, for example, global or universal human rights law regimes. And by enhancing the quality of democratic deliberation, there's international rules that force the domestic process to consider whether, in fact, potential restrictions on trade are useful on net or not. The point, of course, is that even though globalization can have those effects, it doesn't necessarily have to. And in fact, for each one of these arguments, one might think of counter-arguments as well. For example, how financial globalization actually enhances the power of banks and financial intermediaries, how the World Trade Organization has enhanced their intellectual property rules on developing countries, and so on. So my main point here is that, a truly democracy-enhancing globalization would fall far short of hyperglobalization, because there's no guarantee that all the restrictions on the conduct of the national economic policy would be of the sort that would increase the quality of deliberation or would tend to empower the right kinds of things. So I think there's an important difference in principle and in substance between the pursuit of hyperglobalization, which would justify any and all external rules that restrict domestic policy space so as to minimize transactions costs associated with national borders, versus a democracy-enhancing globalization, which would impose only those, and I think in practice mostly procedural restrictions, norms like transparency, accountability, representativeness, use of scientific evidence, and so forth, that would enhance domestic deliberation or are consistent with democratic delegation. And that's necessarily a narrower subset of all the things that you need to do to move towards hyperglobalization. I'm going to just conclude with sort of thinking about broadly three possible paths for the future of globalization. I think the more desirable path, what I've called here the good, is really a path that is necessarily one of managed globalization. One where we just say, well, one that is not one where we say, well, there's nothing we can do about globalization. It's just, just falls from the sky, and that all we need to do is just adjust for it. I think what we need to do is create a better balance between prerogatives of nation states and international rules. And in fact, by restricting continuously the policy space for nation states, I fear that we are undermining both the sets of rules and the legitimacy that is required to maintain open economies. Again, go back to the logic of the Bretton Woods and the embedded liberalism compromise, which I think is very important. I think we're much more likely, the bad path is where we try to operate as if the trilemma did not exist. And I think this is what the Eurozone has looked like. Less urgently, this is what the global economy looks like. I don't think the ugly scenario, the return to the 1930s, is a likely one, because the underlying configuration of powers has shifted significantly in favor of groups that benefit from open trade. So I don't buy the argument of a slippery slope. I think the deeper paradox here is that I think we do more damage to globalization by pushing harder on it, by trying to achieve hyperglobalization in ways that are actually going to undermine the ways in which a healthy and open and a moderately open world economy can actually be sustained. So I think we run the risk that we let the best be the enemy of the good. And I think that's the danger with globalization's future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.